Hello, this is the Demographics Decoded podcast with me, demographer Simon Kuestenmacher.
And me, Michael Yardney, property and wealth creation expert. And this is the podcast where we unveil the trends shaping your future. And today I want to discuss a topic that's been in the media a bit lately, the widening gap between the rich and the poor. Simon, I know you've got a great analogy that brings this issue to life using something familiar. As familiar as actually the cereal aisle in the supermarket. You wrote about that a while ago. What made you use that as an analogy?
Well, I've long felt that the Australian middle class was eroding and looked at different data sets to prove that theory and that gut feeling. And then I was deliberately hunting for some sort of metaphor where you go, what does that actually look like in practice if you run a country where you have fewer people in the middle class and you have more people on the top and more people on the bottom? And then I actually just walked into my local supermarket, and in the cereal aisle, it occurred to me that this is actually what this looks like. And the story is pretty simple. If you look at a cliche middle class breakfast item, that would be a bunch of wheat bix in Australia. And at the moment, they would set you back around 50 cents per 100 gram. That's our benchmark. And then you go, well, but the cereal aisle has much more to offer than just the middle class benchmark item. And so you look at the bottom end, if you will, of the island, of the aisle, and you realize the whole new product category emerged over time. The black and gold end of the spectrum, the Aldi end of the spectrum, that are out there. They are essentially, for all intents and purposes, the same product, but they come at a massive discount, around maybe 50% of the price. And we then realize, what's the reason for this category? Because the deal is we offer you the same utility at a much lower price. And that's fine. It makes sense. If there are more people who need to carefully watch every dollar that they're spending, you offer the same version of a product for cheaper. But then I looked at the Paris end of my local cereal aisle, and you see what is emerging there. The fancy wheat bix categories, the gluten-free mixes, the nutty super grain wheat bix, protein, wheat bix organic, wheat bix kids. Fantastic products, I'm sure, but they come at a steep cost. More than 3 times the price sometimes of our per 100 gram of our middle class benchmark. And you realize what's going on there. These are customers that are not as price sensitive, where the price of the breakfast cereal doesn't matter so much. It is much more that they want a higher utility of their breakfast. They want a better breakfast and they want a much better product. And the margins are well and truly delicious at the wheat bix protein end of the spectrum, whereas they are rather slim at the bottom end of the spectrum. And the middle class just hangs out in the middle, but ultimately it gets increasingly ignored because the shape of the Australian workforce and society as a whole transitioned from the 60s until today completely. In the 60s, our workforce looked like a bell curve, where a couple of poor people existed, a couple of rich people existed, but overwhelmingly this was an egalitarian middle-class society where nobody strayed too far off the center of town, so to speak. But over time, we first flattened the bell curve, and now we even turned it into a letter U, where the middle class is actually the weakest part of the whole society. And the implications from this are much bigger than just our cereal aisle.
Yes, they are. Now, I remember reading this article initially in the New Daily, and you write regularly in the New Daily. Every Saturday, I recommend people look at your articles there and behind a paywall at the Australian. And in fact, when I first read this, you actually made cereal interesting for me. But as I understood more about what you're suggesting, the cereal aisle reflects a range of choices, budget preferences, quality, but it's also shown that there are similar divides when it comes to wealth, opportunity and lifestyle, much different to the Australia a lot of the older generations grew up in, and that's creating a little bit of anxiety at the moment. So
It's creating anxiety and it's creating social problems, if you will. If you are operating in a country that looks like a bell curve, where most people are linked to the middle class in some really real way, the poor people have at least a fighting chance to become a member of the middle class. Most of the rich folks are a result of the middle class. In a U-shaped society, the big bunch of poor people they scramble for this ever shrinking part of the middle class. So there's a lot of competition and it's hard to get into the small middle class. And the rich people, they're usually not a result of the middle class, they're a result of the upper class from yesteryear. So we are providing a less fluent society where it's much more rigid it's not as easy to jump from one state of society, from one rank, if you will, to the next. So social cohesion is at risk there as well.
I think we've got to remember that most people watching this or listening to this are in Australia or in Western societies. So there's lots of parts of the world that would be thrilled to be even in the lower levels of Australian society. But that's not what we here are wanting. We're aspiring to a good lifestyle. Lots of migrants are coming to have a good lifestyle. How did we reach this point, Simon, that the middle segment of the workforce is being hollowed out?
Well, we reached it. Well, part of it is to blame the educational system, I would argue, because I would say that the dumbest thing that we've done in the long run in the educational system was to charge people for their TAFE degrees. Remember that a TAFE degree is the entry ticket to the Australian middle class. If you have at least a technical education there, you get into the trades. This is the middle class backbone of Australian society.
And may I interrupt you for a second, Simon, and just in case we're offending somebody, this is not a judge of people, is it? It's not a judge of
absolutely not
how valuable people are.
Exactly. We're always looking at this from a purely socioeconomic perspective.
Yeah.
And we say stuff like low-skilled jobs. This is very much a technical term, rather than saying you don't need any skills for low-skilled jobs. This only refers to the level of education that's needed. Engineers.
I just thought I'd bring that up because I tend to offend more people than I should.
No, listen, we try to keep the offending to a minimum. But so the idea there is the middle class entry ticket is a TAFE level technical degree, and we put a price point to it. So for some people, this hurdle was too much, and they then stayed in lower qualified and therefore lower paying jobs. And some people looked at this hurdle to the middle class jobs and figured, that's stupid. I don't want to pay for that, because the pay premium that I get for a TAFE degree, while it exists, is not that big. The pay premium that I get for a university degree is much bigger. So I skip the middle class jobs, if you will, and I instantly go to the upper class university level education. And bit by bit, we pushed ever more people of a year 12 cohort into the university system rather than the middle skilled TAFE level education. Which you'd say, to a degree, this is a welcome development, because we do create more Australians in absolute and relative numbers who have highly paying jobs and can therefore have better lives, pay for their retirement in a more comfortable way. That is welcome. But ultimately, it also means that we artificially created a lack of middle-skilled workers, which is actually a welcome development for the few people that picked up a technical education, because all of a sudden the plumbers and electricians and bricklayers of Australia can charge really good hourly rates for their skills. So in a sense, again, not offending anyone, they're overpaid at the moment, because had we introduced more workers, there would have been price competition. At the moment, there is no price competition.
Now, the census actually breaks jobs down into 5 categories, doesn't it? And you've taught me over the years that the higher level of your education in general, the higher your salary is going to be over the lifetime too.
Exactly. So that relationship is still very much alive in Australia, and in most of the Western world. Is the more educated you are, the more money you make. To a degree, of course. A very successful plumber, which is technically a middle-skilled job, will out-earn a primary school teacher, which is a highly skilled job. So there are differences, but overwhelmingly, as a rule of thumb, the more educated you are, the more money you make.
So are there any particular industries that's been affected more than others by this hollowing out?
I'd always point to the housing market. We are living in a country where we see strong population growth and where we have a shortage of dwellings across the full income spectrum. We don't have enough multi-million-dollar, super sexy luxury homes. We don't have enough median-priced homes, and we don't have enough affordable housing. We don't have enough emergency housing either. And so you then look at the shortage of workers that could build this housing, these homes, and the shortage of developers who could build those homes. And you then had to guess which end of this spectrum, this wheat big spectrum, if you will, from top end of the market to bottom end of the market, which end are you servicing? It's quite obvious that you move towards the top end because the margins are bigger. And you always want to remember that property development is a low margin game. You make 15% or thereabouts
And high risk.
Exactly, it is high risk, and it's something like it's easy to go broke as a developer, if you will. So 15% is actually a low margin considering the risk. It's not like sunglasses where the thing costs you $15 to make and you sell it for 800. So these are gigantic margins that this sector doesn't have. And so obviously then everyone moves to the top. The flight to quality argument here is always being raised, and that is going to continue. Of course, then who suffers the most from this development is, let's call it roughly the bottom third of society, because who is developing housing for them? It's not the free market. The free market would be dumb, if you will, to provide housing at this bottom end because they can't possibly make a buck at the moment. So we either have the lack of workers to begin with, and we also have no financial incentive for the private sector to build them. I would have expected that then potentially we'd see a Labour prime minister that grew up in social housing, which Albanese was, that he would introduce a state-owned developer because they could build housing at the bottom end of the market without a profit incentive, but that didn't come. And so now precious few people are building housing at the bottom end of the market. The only people who are actually building housing for the bottom end of the market are a couple of the titans of industries. Reference back to Industrial Revolution England, when the factory owner of yesteryear, the big capitalist, needed to build a village next to their factory in order to get workers for their satanic mills. We're now seeing this, that aged care homes, they provide staff housing on site. Hospitals provide staff housing. Big hotels buy staff housing because they need a lot of low-income workers, and quite often these destinations are actually in high-income regions where they can't possibly find staff. And so if you don't offer housing as well, you don't get staff, and then your whole business model falls down. So there are quite a couple of severe implications, as you see. It starts up as a nice cutesy metaphor about cereal, but there is real implications on the property market here as well.
Well, clearly we're transitioning to a knowledge-based society, and in many ways that's good, but we actually need a more rounded society as well, with workers at all levels. I guess that's partly what the immigration system is trying to fix.
Well, in an ideal way. So how much do we utilize migration for just making a quick buck? That's in a sense international education, the international students that you're getting in. Some of them we want to grab as workers and give them qualifications up to our levels of expectations and so forth. That's great. But to a degree, we are misusing international students just to make a quick buck out of them this is the story of handing out degrees to people who are barely capable to do the basic coursework or something.
What are we going to offend people this week?
No, but this is a well-known issue that we incentivized universities by taking away all of their funding, so they need to make a buck. They need to still operate. And so international students very much subsidize our Australian university system. That's a fact. And you go, well, sure enough, but where are we utilizing skilled migration in the most efficient way to fill the skills gap? Are also to blame for, to be honest. And we are not. So the skills-based element of our migration system should be much more targeted. I would argue it needs to be more employee-sponsored so that you then ultimately get a better choice. You give the market a say in who comes into the country so that the right qualifications are filled. At the moment, the skills migration list that we operate is a bit like Uber Eats, where you order a burger and some fries, and then the burger and fries get delivered to your doorstep. At the moment, we just say we want 50 structural engineers, 200 truck drivers, 500 aged care nurses, and the first people that fit the basic qualifications, they get let into the country, and we don't control that they actually work in their job. So that's a problem. So we could fix the migration system, and we could target it a bit. I'm not saying we need to cut migration numbers down. I actually think the opposite, but we do need to still very much improve it so that it helps us better, because the skill shortage in the middle skilled jobs, that is creating all the pain on the, not all the, it's not the sole responsibility, but it's creating the pain in the housing market as well. We should get more skilled migrants into the country that help us build dwellings.
How do you think this widening gap between the rich and the poor and this U-shaped society we're building is going to affect future generations and their career opportunities, Simon?
Well, one of the first things you can see when you just walk across your neighborhood, when you walk across town, your street, it looks also diverse because people next to you have different skin colors, different sexual orientations, they speak different languages. It's very diverse at first sight. Everyone next to you is just as rich or as poor as you are. We are increasingly segregating our cities based on socioeconomic factors. That means our kids go to schools where people are just as rich or as poor as their parents are. And so in this U-shaped Australia, the rich and the poor have no understanding of how the other half of Australia lives and feels and thinks. And that puts social cohesion at risk, and that's not good. So therefore, all those events that bring people together, we're talking about community festivals, volunteering opportunities, but most importantly in my reading, we're looking at sport. This is spectator sports as well as active sports. Loving and hating the same sports teams really brings people together. And so is the whole idea of playing a sport in an active sense with people from different backgrounds. That's of course more an opportunity in regional communities where the rich and the poor do partake in the same sporting teams. In the big cities, if you put your kids to Auskick or something like this, it's a local neighborhood event. Again, the kids are just as rich or as poor as your kids are.
Just looking again at this widening divide, how's automation, AI, technology playing a role? Is it making a difference, and is it going to create even further disruption?
Well, the risk, of course, that people sometimes put forward there is, there are lots of low-skilled jobs that we will just have the robots take over, and that creates hordes of unemployed people. I don't think so. I think if we take low-skilled jobs away from workers, these workers will be upskilled and move into higher paying jobs, which therefore softens the divide a bit. And I believe this because we've done previous episodes about this. My main reading of the future of Australia is that we're running out of workers. This is the aging of society in action. Even in a high migration country, we're ultimately losing workers. So automation is welcome in my interpretation of the world. And I'd say it could be a bit of an equalizer. We're not talking about massive wealth equalization before we reach something what lots of young policy writers are writing about. This would be the taxation of wealth rather than the taxation of income, which is what we're doing at the moment. Income and consumption is being taxed. It's relatively easy to maintain or retain your wealth once you acquired it. But getting to the wealth, becoming rich is hard, especially if you start from a low base. And so we'll see whether this will actually emerge. This is what young policy writers write about, who are of course not in positions of influence just yet. But ultimately I would say that the tide is slowly moving that way. The argument is always brought forward that we had many events like this in history before, where once the top acquires too much wealth, there is a redistribution. This redistribution can be peaceful and politically motivated, or it can be bloody fought out on the street. I don't see guillotines in the Australian future anytime soon, but so therefore I think it's very helpful to do boring, slow tax reform to avoid these kind of unrests, if you will.
It's not just happening in Australia, though, is it? It's happening in a broader global trend as well, Simon.
Yeah, we are nothing special there, to be honest. Yeah. This development, if you look at all of the most important countries that are relevant to us, look at the UK, look at the US, look at our friends at New Zealand, same narrative. But so, can we undo it is the challenge.
Is there anything we can learn from them? Are they doing it any better?
No, so I think what I would want to point towards, so I'm super critical of my home country of Germany, but Germany long established high-end manufacturing across a multitude of small firms in a multitude in small cities. So that makes sure that Germany still has a very strong middle class. And so we could do this here as well by pushing policies around value-added manufacturing, for example, in agriculture. If we were to produce more food products rather than export raw commodities, that would introduce more middle-class jobs. That would soften this divide a bit.
So are the regions being affected less than the capital cities? I mean, in Australia, we're very different to those other countries, especially the European countries you mentioned, like Germany, where we tend to congregate in a small group of very large cities, don't we?
Absolutely. So this U-shaped of society is not as extreme in the countryside as it is in the big cities. So the segregation in the big cities becomes severe, where you have people who have never been to other parts of their city.
Interestingly, we have a lot of clients from regional Australia, and the wealthier ones there seem to be almost embarrassed about it. I know they won't drive a Mercedes, they'll drive a Toyota Land Cruiser, which costs as much as a Mercedes, but it's a Toyota, so they don't feel out of place in their country town.
Yeah, and you don't tend to want to stand out too much. Yeah? Part of this is the tall poppy syndrome in Australia, where you don't want to be the tallest poppy that then gets cut down. And wealth is a bit more subtle, if you will. But if you've ever been to Beef Week in Rockhampton, of course, where the big beef farmers are, there is a certain kind of dress code, of course, that shows that you're country royalty. But in a sense, the country royalty dress code is different than the Q or Double Bay dress code would be in Melbourne or Sydney.
Interesting. I'd never thought about that, but of course, you're right. So you're aware of this, demographers and economists are aware of it. Does the government know what's going on? What role have they got, and are they doing anything to stop this shrinking of our middle class?
No, they're not doing enough, is my thing. So I think what we will be seeing very soon is universal free TAFE education. That would then allow a couple more people to make the jump into TAFE education. That would slow down the skills shortage in those middle skilled jobs. That would be a welcome development for the country as a whole. And it also becomes increasingly more honest educational system. Because, and again, we mentioned it in the past, Australia runs a very simple business model. We do mining, we do agriculture, we do tourism, we do international education. That's all we export to the world. There's nothing else that matters. And these four industries alone do not require that we send half of our year 12 cohort to the universities, which is what we're doing at the moment. So we're actually purposefully over-educating our society. This is, of course, from a workforce perspective. Intellectually speaking, you will never be overeducated. You and I, we are all too dumb. We don't think enough, we don't read enough. But as a system, you can be overeducated. That means we put too much resources into education that then doesn't get utilized in the workforce. So if we were to put more money into the TAFE system, subsidize it, that would then make the university system, which then becomes a bit more expensive in comparison, less attractive, and we would then utilize workers better. These are the kind of levers that government can pull.
Interesting that we are changing, society is changing. Are you worried about the future? Are you worried about this hollowing out of the middle class and the class divide?
Yeah, it's not helpful for a country that
No.
that has so many people that have no idea what the other the other cohort feels like. That means if you have rich people in the positions of power and influence, they don't understand the plight of the poor people, so to speak. This is quite often when people talk poorly about politicians. They say they don't know what's going on. And you've seen all those, back in the day it was called the loaf of bread test, when you just asked the politician what a loaf of bread cost. They got it wrong. We recently has a housing minister who didn't know the rents in Sydney. These are the kind of things that is actually anti-democratic in nature. Because if the bottom half of society, or whatever it is, doesn't feel that they're represented, they resent democracy. And that is a step too far. Like we want to make sure that we take care of our society as a whole, to make sure that the whole democratic system doesn't break down. That's something that I value a lot. I particularly think politicians should value the democracy that they are ruling over. And so I think bit by bit we are intensifying our efforts there. So for universal free TAFE, I'm dead certain we'll have installed by the end of the decade.
Interestingly, the lack of democracy comes out in the housing market as well, where younger generations just believe that the older generations don't understand the plight they're going through. So clearly the wealthening wide gap isn't just an economic challenge or interesting numbers and figures. It does impact the life of millions of Australians. Now, for those people who are watching this and listening to this, and I know there's a lot of business people who are doing this, I think you can see that Simon brings a unique perspective as a demographer and a partner of the demographics group. And if you believe this would be interesting to understand what's going to happen in the trends ahead, you can use Simon's knowledge. You can book him to speak to your company, to your organisation, I know you instruct and consult to companies as well as organisations and governments. So I'll leave a link in the show notes to have a chat with Fiona at the demographics group to see, Simon, that's what you spend most of your day doing, teaching how this affects people's specific industries.
Exactly. That's all I do actually. It's the whole idea is to figure just that out. It's like how do you adjust your product offering in a society where the middle keeps shrinking? That's an important question that you have to ask. As a society, as a government, you need to figure out how do I maintain social cohesion in this. As a local government, I'm literally being tasked to look after all the people in my area. But if you have this U-shaped society, and how do you charge rates to begin with? How do you make sure that you provide decent levels of service to everyone? You pretend that the society still looks like a bell curve where everyone is more or less near the middle, but it's the opposite. So it's quite easy then if you only focus on providing lots of services to the poor, that the top end gets resentful as well. So it's very, very hard, and it takes quite a bit of a good balancing act to get those things right.
I guess it's going to give us lots of things to discuss in future episodes of Demographics Decoded. So if you've got some benefit from today's show, if it's resonated with you and you don't currently subscribe to this on YouTube or on your favourite podcast app, just stop for a sec and subscribe so that each week Simon and I can give you our thoughts. Of course, there's lots of back episodes now that you can listen to as well. Simon, thank you for your insights about the cereal aisle. I look forward to catching up with you again next week.
Been great fun again.
This Demographics Decoded podcast has been brought to you by Metropole Property Strategists. We provide a complete range of services to help our clients safely create intergenerational wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you're looking to buy an investment property or your next home, why not have a discovery chat with one of our wealth strategists? Just go to metropole.com.au and explore your options. You'll find we're much more than just another buyer's agent. We provide a complete range of services, including property advisory, wealth advisory, home buying, buyer's agency, property management, renovations, and development management services. The team at Metropole will help you with frameworks that I've fine-tuned over 5 decades and we've been helping clients with for well over 25 years. We're big enough to tip the scales in your favour, but still small enough to care. In between these Demographics Decoded shows, you can follow me on social media, and I suggest you also follow Simon Kuestenmacher. You'll find him regularly posting on all social media platforms. And thanks for spending the last little while with Simon and me. I hope you got some benefit from the show. And if you did, and you know somebody who may also benefit, please tell them about Demographics Decoded. There's a share button on every podcast app. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you're definitely going to be doing us a favour, helping us in our quest to make as many people as possible aware of the demographic changes that are going to be shaping their future. And of course, if you don't currently subscribe, we'd love you to. And of course, any of the information that we've been sharing with you is general information because we don't know your specific circumstances.